Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here this afternoon for AOSIS COP26 side event, the development of the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, economic and scientific approaches to understanding vulnerability. My name is Fran Fuller. I'm advisor to the chair of AOSIS based in New York, covering mitigation, loss and damage, sustainable development, and some macroeconomic issues. For over 3 decades, SIDS have been calling for a formulation of vulnerability indices and other indicators to reflect their ecological fragility and economic vulnerability. Most SIDS are middle or high income countries and are ineligible for concessional financing due to their income classification. SIDS have been consistently arguing that GNI per capita classification does not account for their unique vulnerabilities. And there's been significant progress to date. And as chair of AOSIS, Antigua and Barbuda is championing this issue with the objective to work to be completed by 2022. Today, we're looking at the latest progress on the MVI, approaches to better understand vulnerability of SIDS, especially as they relate to climate change, and next steps on adoption and the implementation of the MVI by the international financial system. And Antigua and Barbuda, who will give our keynote, we'll start with Minister Joseph, who's the Minister of Health, Wellness and the Environment of Antigua and Barbuda, who will give us our keynote address, followed by a presentation from Dr. Adele Thomas, and then we'll have an interactive panel discussion. Thank you all for being here in person and online. And with no further ado, Minister Joseph. Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, let me join Fran in expressing our appreciation for your presence here today. In 1992, at the first Earth Summit, world leaders agreed that small island developing states face unique challenges. And as a result, were recognized as a, open quote, a special case for sustainable development, close quote. This was almost 30 years ago. The nature of our economies and our inherent structural characteristics as being small islands exposes us to economic and non-economic shocks. But in particular, the effects of climate change increase our vulnerability and leaves us even more exposed. The rapid evolution of COVID-19 pandemic from a health crisis to an overwhelming development and economic crisis brings to the forefront the true vulnerabilities of our islands and the multiplicity of catastrophes that are before us. While our islands continue to confront this pandemic, the climate crisis did not pause. Sea levels continue to rise. The earth continued to warm, and the ferocity of storms are unrelenting. The latest IPCC report indicates that without redoubling efforts and raising ambitions, our islands would be unrecognizable to others, but uninhabitable to us. With the multiplicity and magnitude of crises we face, we see little way out unless the international community double its efforts to aggressively decarbonize the world and put the provisions in place that would allow us to build our resilience against current and future crises. Due to the pandemic, our economies are in a free fall, falling at a magnitude of which we have not experienced since the Great Depression. And because of the climate crisis, our people are being forced to move to higher grounds and build infrastructures that are not in uniformity with island life. Instead of enjoying the cool island breeze, we are often preparing for the ferocities of tropical cyclones. And instead of consuming local agricultural provisions Because of severe droughts, we are forced to import foods that are not only unhealthy, but goods with high transaction costs due to our remoteness. The economic and environmental contractions we are experiencing will have far-reaching and enduring consequences for poverty eradication, employment, growth, and social welfare. In addition, because we are so heavily indebted, and this is no fault of our own, we are forced to borrow more to avert a total collapse of our economies and rebuild after devastating climate events. The consequences of this implies that our islands would not be able to achieve the SDGs, the goals of the Paris Agreement, or the vision of Samoa Pathway. These crises have thrown us into a socio-economic and financial quandary, and the lack of effective global solutions to help us out for this predicament is worrying. Instead, we are left to navigate a minefield of complex and bureaucratic frameworks as we seek the help. Without systemic change and immediate and tailored policy actions, there is a real risk that this economic and environmental crisis would lead to humanitarian crisis in small island developing states. We will be forced to leave our beloved islands to seek refuge elsewhere. The world would then face the reckoning of a refugee crisis. All is not lost. There is still hope, and the use of a multidimensional vulnerability index is a part of this hope. The UN Secretary General's report makes it abundantly clear that there is need for MVI, one that addresses the unique vulnerabilities of SIDS. The process of graduation and measuring our development by only using GNI is flawed if our vulnerabilities and resilience are considered. We are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, yet we are unable to access climate finance because of this flawed measurement. The MVI can correct such an inaccuracy. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. The data has been collected, and now is the time for us to move this process forward. We need the support of the international financial institutions and the developed partners to urgently help us to avert the looming development and humanitarian crises. We simply do not have the means, nor do we have the access to do it by ourselves. The time is now. The work has begun, and by the end of 2022, we must adopt and implement the MVI. I wish to thank you for your presence and trust that we might have a fruitful dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Joseph, for those opening remarks and setting the tone for this afternoon's discussion. So next we have Dr. Adele Thomas to give us a presentation to set the scene on matching vulnerability and access, the economic and scientific approaches to capturing vulnerability of SIDS. Dr. Thomas is the director of the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center at the University of the Bahamas. Adele's research is centered on varying aspects of adaptation and social vulnerability, including examining the potential of insurance as an adaptation strategy and challenges facing small islands in managing loss and damage, among many other issues. Adele is also a lead author on the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report and the Special Report on 1.5, and has authored a variety of other issues. She is an expert on the issue, and we look forward to hearing you today.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Fran, for that very warm welcome. Thanks for the invitation to present on the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, the MVI, for SIDS. As we've heard in the very comprehensive opening remarks, The MVI is a much needed tool for SIDS, but it has faced significant delays in being developed and used. And so in my presentation, I will be highlighting 3 key issues that need to be addressed to inform an MVI for SIDS. These 3 issues are all interrelated and highlight some of the challenges of developing and agreeing upon an MVI for SIDS. Before we get into them, I'll provide a brief contextual background on where these issues are coming from. There have been a broad range of vulnerability indices and frameworks that have been created by a variety of researchers and institutions over the past 25 years. To facilitate the development of an MVI for SIDS, the UN hosted a series of technical sessions earlier this year, inviting 19 institutions to delve into different approaches for an MVI and to showcase research on vulnerability indices. These sessions highlighted that there are many different approaches to this issue of multidimensional vulnerability. Some approaches only focus on SIDS, others apply to all developing countries. Some indices are being used to inform finance decisions already, such as the Caribbean Development Bank's Index. Others are purely used in research, and they highlight differences in vulnerability among SIDS and also at the subnational scale. These many different actors and approaches offer a basis to build upon, but they also highlight some key differences in the conceptualization of vulnerability. And so drawing from these many different approaches, as well as the very helpful discussions that the UN has facilitated over the past months, I'll now get into the 3 major issues which seem to be sticking points on agreeing on an MVI for SIDS. The first issue is deciding upon which factors affect the vulnerability of SIDS in achieving sustainable development. When we think about multidimensionality and sustainable development, then the 3 pillars of sustainable development become very relevant. And so in the discussions, it's become clear that there is a preference for the MVI to have economic, environmental, and social dimensions. Having this focus on the 3 pillars of sustainability shows the shortcomings of some existing and proposed indices, many of which only focus on environmental or economic factors. For example, the widely used Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index, the EVI, has a number of benefits, including its status as an official UN index and already being used by some financial institutions. However, the EVI only focuses on economic and environmental factors and does not include consideration of social factors that also contribute to vulnerability. In contrast, there are indicators such as the one used by the Caribbean Development Bank, which covers all 3 dimensions of sustainability and includes social factors such as homicide and gender-based violence and poverty. Differences in what is included in different indices highlight the need for clarity on whether the MVI should focus only on structural characteristics that can't be changed, or if it should include factors that increase vulnerability, but that may be changed by internal policies. Structural characteristics are things such as small size, remoteness, and exposure to climate hazards, which cannot be changed and which makes SIDS uniquely vulnerable. Social characteristics, such as levels of poverty and crime, can in theory be addressed through effective internal policies, but they are also affected by structural characteristics. Related to this is debate about whether or not debt should be included in the MVI. Some indices exclude debt as they don't see it as relevant or as a structural characteristic, while others include debt as a key factor that affects vulnerability and which is exacerbated by economic and environmental issues, such as having to use national resources to recover from extreme events which are made more intense due to climate change. And so there remains much room for clarity around which factors should be included in the MVI to accurately represent the particular vulnerabilities of SIDS. The second issue is ensuring that the MVI is feasible and useful. The challenges with availability and quality of data in SIDS are well known, and so it is imperative that the MVI considers these challenges. That means that the indicators that are used for the MVI need to be feasible in the SIDS context. Desirable indicators may follow the STAR approach. They may be simple, transparent, affordable, and replicable. Simple, so they are easily understood by those that are using the index. We don't want the MVI to be so complex that it is only understood by highly specialized experts. The MVI should be transparent. The methodology used must be clearly explained, and data used should be available to all. Indicators need to be affordable. Data needed must be relatively easy to obtain and to process without being excessively time-consuming or obscure to source. We don't want additional burdens on collecting data needed for the MVI. The MVI also needs to be reproducible. It shouldn't be difficult to reproduce the index over time with updated data. And this need for reproducibility is particularly important if we consider the need to update MVI scores after extreme events or other economic shocks, which may drastically change the economic situation of SIDS and affect vulnerability. And we saw the need for this with the extensive impacts that COVID has had in SIDS. The STAR approach has implications for the number and complexity of indicators that will be part of an MVI. Some of the proposed indices have as many as 65 different indicators, which makes calculation complex and prone to issues of data availability. And some vulnerability indices cannot be used since all SIDS simply do not have the data available that is needed. More complex approaches to calculating an MVI, such as advanced economic modeling or climate modeling, may provide highly accurate assessments, but may not be viable. While they may give more detailed accounts of current and future vulnerability, they may not be sustainable to reproduce over time due to the need for extensive technical expertise and resources that are often tied to a specific project and won't be able to be reproduced on a continuous basis. And so it will be critical to have a balance between an MVI that accurately conveys the vulnerability of SIDS and that still meets the desirability of being simple, transparent, accessible, and replicable. And the third and final issue is clarity on the purpose of the MVI and how it will be used. Support for MVI has focused on its potential to unlock access to concessional financing for SIDS. However, discussions have highlighted that there may not be an appetite from financial institutions to replace the GNI per capita criteria, but rather that the MVI may complement this approach and be used to improve resource allocations. While increasing access to concessional finance may be one of the uses of the MVI, it is also important that the pot of concessional finance is increased so that we don't end up in a situation where there are more SIDS competing for already limited resources. Discussion has also highlighted that the MVI may be an important tool for debt restructuring, particularly for the many middle-income SIDS. Using the MVI would support the need to adjust high interest rates and increase eligibility of SIDS for debt suspension, debt forgiveness, and debt for climate swaps. In addition to concessional finance and debt, which require the MVI to be calculated at the national scale, there are also other potential uses of the MVI where it would be helpful to have subnational assessments of vulnerability. The MVI can be a useful tool for evidence-based decision-making to show where there may be a need for allocation of resources and policies. This can be done using a sectoral or a geographic approach and would require subnational data and indicators. The MVI can also be used as a monitoring, evaluation, and measurement tool to track how vulnerability has changed over time in response to implementing different policies and programs. And this again could benefit from indicators and data at the subnational scale. And so having clarity on the appetite for using the MVI at both the national and subnational scales would assist in the identification of indicators and factors to include in the index. Clarity on how the MVI will be used as it relates to concessional finance is also an area where further discussion and consensus is needed. And so I'll end it there. I'm looking forward to the process of working through these issues and to our panel discussion today. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adele, especially for setting the tone on the complexity of the issue and the challenges that SIDS have been facing to date and the options that have been available on the table thus far, but also in terms of the opportunities for SIDS as we move towards developing this MVI. So now we turn to our distinguished panel. On the panel, we have Honorable Maureen Joseph, the Minister of Health, Wellness and the Environment for Antigua and Barbuda, and also the current chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. We also have Fiona Clowder, who is the Regional Ambassador for Latin America and Caribbean with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and part of the COP26 Unit Joint Team. I hope I got that right. Then we have Mr. Sai Navoti, who is the Chief of the SIDS Unit in UNDESA, which is the Department of Economic and Social Affairs in the UN, based in UN headquarters in New York. And prior to his current post, he also served as lead negotiator for G77 and also for the Alliance of Small Island States in 2012. So we have somebody in our corner here. And last but definitely not least, we have Stephen Hammer, who's the Senior Climate Policy Strategist for the World Bank, leading on international climate engagement with the United Nations, the G7, the G20, and other development partners. So also a critical partner as we move forward in this discussion. So thank you all for joining us. And we're going to start off with Fiona. An opening question. Access to finance has always been a critical issue for SIDS and on climate finance especially, but also of course on the development finance side. Given your work, the UK's work as the president of the G7 and COP26 this year, in your view, how can the MVI assist in SIDS accessing development and climate finance?
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak at this, I think, very important event as part of COP26. So under our COP26 presidency, of course, we've had the key objectives. We are, as ever, trying to encourage mitigation, countries to reduce their emissions, but also we've been trying to get a greater focus on vulnerability, on the need for adaptation and resilience, but crucially also about finance, both about the volume of finance, but also about access to that finance. And so we're already seeing during this very important COP26 conference, movement on these issues. But I really welcome today's discussion on the MVIs, because it's been clear in my work, both Latin America, but particularly in the Caribbean, how important this issue is. And our world is changing and indeed has changed already. So perhaps the way we look at these issues need to change. And I think Adele has given us a very clear overview of some of the key factors and issues and ways in which we might look at this in future. So from the UK, there's practical help that we can offer. That includes our new £40 million SIDS Development and Resilience Programme. And that's going to help support SIDS access wider finance and deliver adaptation resilience programmes. But clearly we need to do much more to address the problems with the policies and processes. And so the UK has been working with AOSIS, with Belize, with Fiji over the last 2 years to press for improved access. And we've jointly issued a call for action that sets out the steps that providers can and should take now. Our ministers have made clear that the current system is really broken, the approach towards small island developing states. And their access to finance, the pressures they face, the scale of the threat from climate change and their vulnerability means that that approach is not morally defensible in today's world. But this is not simple. As we've already heard, a challenge is the use of eligibility criteria that don't actually accurately capture the development position of SIDS. Pure dollar values don't tell the full story of a country's resilience, readiness, and ability to finance its future. And that's a particular problem for SIDS. And so that's why the UK has called for providers of finance to do more to stop the actual increased exacerbation of risk that is embedded in the current approaches. And that means reviewing how the MVIs can be used to improve our approach. And the UK, of course, as a Commonwealth member, is part of a process to develop a universal vulnerability indices. But we recognize that there are the other indices out there. And so welcome the fact that international bodies are taking the role of MVIs more seriously. And we believe there are ways in which making use of the MVIs and Gini can work together. So we welcome the work being done so far, being led by the United Nations, in particularly the Secretary General's recent paper, highlighting the potential roles that MVIs can play, and we support the efforts of the UN to take that work forward. And so we hope that organizations that do not yet take vulnerability into account will consider the role of MVIs in the future. The only option that should be off the table is do nothing, because what's very, very clear from the world we're in, from all the discussions this week at COP26, is that the problems are urgent, the problems are increasing, and most crucially, we need to take action, and action needs money. So we need to urgently fix the problems with access to finance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and also to outline some of the work that the UK has been doing, and also the point that you made that it is morally indefensible in today's world to proceed as we are. So thank you for that. Moving on to DESA. DESA and OHRLS have been provided a lot of support to SIDS over the years to get to where we are as it relates to the process to development and adopt the MVI for SIDS. We'd be grateful to hear from you in terms of what is DESA doing and the progress that you've made in terms of the development of the MVI.
Thank you kindly, Ms. Fuller. Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to thank the Alliance of Small Island States for inviting the Department of Economic and Social Affairs to also be part of this discussion this afternoon. The Office of the High Representatives for Least Developed, Landlocked, and Small Island Developing States, OHRLS and DESA, we are the secretariat that work very closely with the SIDS constituency in the United Nations headquarters in New York, particularly the work in the General Assembly. And over the years, in fact, 3 decades, we have been working together with the SIDS constituency in assisting them formulate what we are now progressing to call the multidimensional vulnerability index. This is not a new work. You heard Dr. Adele said that, and you heard from our UK representative this afternoon that this has been a talk for decades. It came to a stop temporarily in the United Nations General Assembly when the Committee for Policy Development of the United Nations adopted the index that is now currently being used to evaluate the graduation of small island developments of least developed countries. Now, that work started by the call made by the small island developing states. It ended up being used as a index to evaluate the graduation of LDCs. And it stopped for a while and didn't start again in earnest until the year 2019, when the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States wrote to the Secretary General of the United Nations, urging him to revisit this issue and develop the multi-vulnerability index. In fact, the commendation really, Ms. Fuller should go to the Alliance of Small Island States for not diverting the attention from this very important issue. When the COVID-19 hit the global, hit us, it exacerbated, and that was one of the reasons why we have started this work again in earnest now. Where it is up to, you heard from Ms. Adele the explanation of a big consultation that was carried out last year by the Secretariat, OHRLS in DESA, where we examined all institutions, both the United Nations institutions and those that are outside the United Nations institutions who are working on some kind of vulnerability index for small island developing states. And the outcome of that exercise was the one that was summarized very succinctly to us this afternoon by Dr. Adele. Now, carrying on from that fact-finding exercise, I want to, in fact, pause here and just mention Ms. Fuller, the presence with us this afternoon of the United Nations resident coordinator from Samoa, Ms. Simona Marinescu. She's sitting in the corner there. Now, Ms. Marinescu, after the receipt of the Secretary General from the letter from AOSIS, led a concerted United Nations efforts in small island developing states to compile a MBI for SIDS. And they did it within a year. And that MBI is now available, and it has become also an inspiration to the Secretary General, who has now issued his report, which our colleague from the UK was referring to, that was published early in October this year. Now, that report, Ms. Fuller, contains a number of recommendations the Secretary General wants the members of the United Nations General Assembly to do and to be guided by if they wish to take this process forward. In fact, the Secretary General recommended that this matter should be handled in an intergovernmental process. Now, this is a EU's position, because we could very easily take this process out of the intergovernmental. In order for it to attract all the consent and consensus, it should lie very well right into the intergovernmental process. And the chair of EOSIS and our colleagues are leading that process, and we must thank them for that. A number of other recommendations was said by the Secretary General, including the uses, the possible uses, the possible coordination of work. But I would like to now say, to answer your question, is the finalization of work going forward. What is left to do now? Now, I can say, and my colleagues from OHRLS sitting here, Magnus and David, my colleagues from the SIDS units are here. They are the two gentlemen who coordinate the second committee work on this item. And in fact, this afternoon, straight after this conversation, the second committee will be meeting in New York to finalize the resolution of the General Assembly that will decide whether or not we are going forward with this matter. Now, what is currently before the committee is there is a recommendation that the work of the MVI to be carried forward by the General Assembly by a high-level panel. Now, this high-level panel is to be co-chaired by two eminent persons, one from the north and one from the south. The person from the south is preferably is to be a small islander. And then this panel is to work, it will be appointed by the General Assembly, the President of the General Assembly, and they have been tasked to come up with this index by the end of 2022. The General Assembly, the Secretary General is recommending 1 year to do this job. Now, we have been waiting for this work for 3 decades. And one of the reasons why the Secretary General has put a sense of urgency into it, he was motivated by the work that was done by the resident coordinators in SIDS, who were able to do this work, come up with an equation within a year. So the Secretary General himself has now recommended to the General Assembly that the high-level panel to be instituted is to do this work and present its finding by the end of 2022. So this is how it is going forward. We are really very encouraged that this is now gaining traction. I was invited into an interparliamentary meeting that was occurring on Sunday, and I could hear speakers from some of the parliaments around the world speaking of the need for us to develop something complementary to the GDP. And we are heading towards the right direction. And there is now consensus. We are very glad to hear our partners from the developed countries also saying the same sentiments. Thank you kindly.
Thank you so much, Sai, for that. And I would also be remiss to not acknowledge Simona, who's a UN resident coordinator in Samoa. Thank you for coming. So our next question is going to go to Stephen from the World Bank. In the bank's perspective, how can an MVI address some of the gaps that are found within the use of the GNI, primarily gaps that are related to vulnerability?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to join this conversation today. This is a fascinating discussion and extraordinarily relevant. I'm going to start just by prefacing, to make sure we're understand the context in which we've been operating. Growing focus on climate change, integrating climate considerations into our different financing instruments, trying to take account of risk and vulnerability as criteria that will influence the design of our projects, but also the level of financing and the type of financing that we've been making available. One of our instruments, IDA, which is for the poorest countries, we're in the midst of a replenishment right now. That is, in the discussions with donors, there's a growing focus on increasing the attention to climate considerations as part of that. Part of it relates to risk and vulnerability, and that at least 50% of resources should be dedicated to adaptation and resilience as part of our projects. We also, just geographically, we've been seeing an expansion of our lending to small island states. The Pacific Island portfolio in particular has doubled in recent years. So part of it is a reflection of the growing needs, of those countries. But as part, to move on from there to look at this larger question of kind of assessing vulnerability. Again, part of what we've learned over the years is through this project assessment lens. And how we take account of vulnerability. We've created a climate change knowledge portal that all of our teams make reference to try so that they can get the latest IPCC data and apply that to the projects. And in doing so, influence the design. We've made a commitment to align our portfolio with the goals of the Paris Agreement. The so-called term that you may have heard for MDB is known as Paris alignment. And there's an entire methodology focused on ensuring, that we're taking account of adaptation and resilience considerations there as well. So there are methodological approaches that we can be drawing on for all of that. That's as a starting point. Going forward, there are other things that we've also done over the years through some of our knowledge work in terms of analyzing the poverty implications of climate change, the temporal impacts of climate change, the distributional impacts of climate change in terms of national or subnational or regional impacts. We have increasingly been investing in data and metrics to try and understand how we can unpack these issues and how we can better understand where the greatest challenges will be and what that implies in terms of, again, the way we design our projects or the type of technical support that we provide to clients. So, we're happy to bring these resources to bear as part of this conversation. Most recently, as part of our new climate change action plan we announced this past spring, we announced a new country climate diagnostic that'll be a new core diagnostic akin to what we've done in the past with financial risk in terms of what we've done in terms of poverty. But this is really an attempt to, in a very comprehensive way, both at the sector level and also at the macroeconomy level, try and understand how climate is going to affect the development trajectory within a country. We'll be doing one of these new studies every 5 years, updating it every 5 years. We're doing about 30 of them this year just to get things going. And so we're in the midst of, developing that right now. Part of the methodological approach that we're drawing on was from a resilience assessment that we did for the government of Fiji 3 years ago when they served as COP president. And we had done a national assessment looking at multiple sectors to try and understand the vulnerabilities that were faced there and what that implied in terms of investments, in terms of policies, what have you. Most recently, and this is a report that is just coming out literally, I think in the next 10 days, a new report called 360-Degree Resilience, a guide to prepare the Caribbean for a new generation of shocks. It looks at 21 different metrics across six action areas. So, and it goes down, and it focuses on firms and households. It focuses on infrastructure and the type of urban or coastal plans that we have. It looks at health and education systems. It looks at how people and firms manage residual risks and natural disasters. And then it also speaks in macro fiscal and financial terms. And it's not a ranking per se that would allow you to compare across, but it's really intended to drive a conversation that, you know, as you look across countries, there's been less action, less policy engagement in a particular country on these different dimensions. And so this is an area where we can possibly provide support, possibly provide technical assistance going forward. So it helps gauge where there might be attention paid on a forward-looking basis for new policies or changes in institutions or creation of new institutions that can actually begin to help address these issues. Now, in terms of linking, you know, use of these kinds of indices to finance, we're not there yet. But, you know, conversations have already started internally. And, you know, we're looking at ways that even for countries that are eligible for IBRD resources, that there can be some concessional resources brought to bear, almost putting things on IDA terms. So again, very early day, but understand that these kinds of conversations are happening. And I think that through, you know, the type of process that I was just mentioning, you know, we are happy to contribute what we've learned over the years. You know, we're not going to say we have, Dr. Thomas, you laid out a whole lot of, you know, resources and information that's already out there, and we're happy to add to it. But we also want to learn from that, because our ability to serve our clients best depends on having access to the best type of data and methods. So, you know, I think we would be very happy to figure out how we can engage as part of this process going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. I'd love to hear more about the diagnostics that you're working on and how the macroeconomic works with the sector level and what countries you're working on, and whether any SIDS fall into that. So maybe a follow-up discussion. Also, we welcome your offer to join us in the discussions that will happen over the next year. And so we will be reaching out around that. Si's nodding his head. Minister, I know that you are going to have to leave relatively soon, but I would love to give you the floor to basically outline, you know, SIDS have been advocating for this for decades now. And given the negative impact of climate change on SIDS and the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic, especially that's very close to your heart, you're Minister of Health as well. Why is it so critical right now to have the immediate development and application of an MVI?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I want to express my appreciation to you and to Dr. Thomas for really setting the stage for this discussion. I find myself very fortunate because here I am between the UK and the UN at a time when I'm seeing unfolding a reality that I've long waited for. I was the Minister of Finance in 1990 for Antigua and Barbuda. In 1995, there was a Hurricane Louis that struck Antigua, Category 5, destroyed 95% of the homes in Antigua and Barbuda. 95% of the homes were damaged. That was in September 11. I think in October or November, I had to travel to the Washington, D.C. to the World Bank meeting. And in that discussion at the World Bank, we laid out the dilemma Antigua found itself in. There were no funding because Antigua was considered a middle-income country. We couldn't borrow any money. We were disqualified. But the amazing thing to me is that when we went through the consultation, what was offered to Antigua was not assistance for recovery, was an IMF program. And in that IMF program, the first requirement was for Antigua to lay off workers from the private sector. Now, can you imagine people who had their homes blown down, they were not working, and the government was asked to lay them off? Those are some of the conditions that small island developing states have had to endure for all these years. And this is why it's music to my ears that we are finally getting to the point when we can have an MVI. The point of using one factor, you might say, to determine the vulnerability of the country is not really practical. And that is the crux of the matter. Antigua and Barbuda, and I have to leave now, but I want to give one more illustration. In 2020, in March, before COVID, we were on a trajectory of a 10% growth in the economy. Then came COVID, and the entire situation changed because our economy is 90% reliant on tourism. Our airports had to close. There were hardly any travel taking place during COVID. So from a projection of, say, 10% growth, we had to close down the economy, where we are now looking at the possibility of negative growth. Now, the issue of risk in terms of pandemic, climate events, are not factors in determining your vulnerability. It's only one factor. If you're lucky that you have a vibrant economy and your per capita income goes up, you're graduated, but all it takes for you to be thrown out of your classroom after you're graduated is one event. And this is what has to be brought to the attention of the international financial sector. And so I'm very pleased to hear also from the World Bank their considerations being given to this MVI. And I really trust that the objective of the United Nations to have this thing, this convention in place within 12 months would really become a reality. And this goes not only for Antigua and Barbuda, but for all small island developing states. The situation will be worsened because at this COP, we are now learning that we might not be able to keep 1.5 alive. And if we can't keep 1.5 alive, then there'll be a lot of disasters and crises face small island developing states. So I have to depart now to another event. I want to say thank you very much for this opportunity. And I trust that we all will have a successful COP. And don't take our eyes off of small island developing states, because we're the ones that will pay the heavy price for climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Minister Joseph, for those remarks. I remember, Lewis, I was actually in high school when the hurricane hit and I didn't have electricity for 3 months afterwards. It was that bad. So I think that it's really important to remember that those types of catastrophic events are so impactful on our GDP, our economic status, but also our social issues in country. And I just wanted to go back to a point that, Stephen, you made around you've seen interest in donors increasing attention to climate change and their potential interest in at least 50% of the finance to adaptation. I do hope that that does translate into the negotiating rooms. Just wanted to point that out. And so just coming back to Ambassador Clowder. So From a developed country perspective, especially as you sit with the UK here as a COP presidency, you can kind of see the landscape a little more. And there was a lot of consultations that the government had over the past year, well, more than a year, given the postponement of the COP. But why is it so important that the MVI is taken on board by other developed country partners? You know, the UK has expressed a lot of support to this issue, but from your perspective, why is it important that others come on board at this point?
Well, I think as we've seen through our COP26 discussions so far, but also crucially, the very important voice of the small island developing states and their vulnerability. And as Minister Joseph has just outlined, the hard reality that those countries are already facing. And so we have to, as a world, we are all in this together. We have to find ways of helping those more vulnerable countries and helping them with the due urgency that is needed, and also helping them with the practical measures so that this is not just talking about it, but ultimately this is about people's quality of life, it's about people's livelihoods, and it's about people's lives. So I think as we've heard today on the MVIs, that is a way forward that helps inform future decisions, future allocation of finance, future prioritization of action, and crucially gives due profile on a fair basis to the countries involved. And so from the UK, I've mentioned our engagement through the Commonwealth on the development of a Universal Vulnerability Index, and very much our support for the UN process, and the recommendation on MVIs from our call to action issued by the UK, IOSIS, Fiji, and Belize. And on access, we're working to raise awareness, we're working to improve processes amongst all providers of finance, obviously through the discussions here in Glasgow, but also through wider work, the focus on the task force on access to climate finance, which the UK is co-chairing with Fiji. And that task force is aiming to transform the way climate finance is accessed through a new approach based on partners' own national climate action plans and priorities. And I think that's very important that those that are in need define what is needed and that others help them access the finance to address that. So we're investing £100 million in supporting that process. And to support the delivery of this new approach, the task force has delivered a set of principles and recommendations to guide providers and recipients in how climate finance should be accessed, programmed, and used. And the task force steering committee includes 4 of the biggest bilateral donors of climate finance: Germany, Sweden, UK, and the US, and also 2 multilateral providers, GCF and the World Bank. We're now encouraging as many climate finance providers as possible to follow this new approach. And we're trialing the approach because also I think the practicality of its application is very, very important. And so there's 5 pioneer countries involved, including 2 SIDS, so including Fiji and Jamaica, together with finance providers and other key partners. And those partner countries and donors will explore how best to take forward the pioneer trials. And those trials will inform efforts to change wider global approaches to how partners access the funds they need to support their climate action plans. And I think that reference to a wider global approach, we all live on this planet together. We all need to find a way forward to address the challenges that face everybody, but crucially, we need to help those most in need of help and those most vulnerable from the future impacts of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And noting the time, and everybody probably has somewhere to head off to. Sai and Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to give any closing remarks before we head to the closing with Ambassador Webson.
Now, being aware of the time, friend, thank you very much. All I need to say that the Secretary General of the United Nations, in his Our Common Agenda, He presented to member states 12 areas of how we could improve together. The fourth, he said, now is the time to correct a glaring blind spot in how we measure economic prosperity. Gross domestic product fails to capture the human and environmental destruction of some business activities. I call for the new measure to complement GDP. And that is coming from the Secretary General, and the United Nations system is fully in support of that call. Thank you.
Thank you, Sai. Stephen?
Yeah, just thank you again for the opportunity to participate today, and again, echo the notion that the work that you're discussing is something that we've, by necessity, been trying to take account of. And so we would welcome the opportunity to share what we've learned and learn from this process along the way. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And we will be reaching out in the next year, especially once we get back to New York and follow up on this process. And in closing, we're going to invite Ambassador Webson, who's the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN. Ambassador Webson.
Thank you very much. As I was sitting there, one of the things that struck my mind is all of us, or most of us who live in a developing country, just sitting down in this room, don't it remind you of primary school? You're in a class and you could hear the other class and you could hear the other class. How we learned, I don't know. I thought I would say that because it really was going through my mind as I was sitting there. So, wow. Anyway, very quickly, this topic is so important to us. And I've heard all the speakers have emphasized the things that we have been talking about for the last 12 to 18 months and for the last 30 years, as you heard. It was very pleasing to hear the information shared with us from the World Bank. And that, and as Fran said, Stephen, we will be checking with you. We will be working with you as we have been doing. But some of the things you have discussed, you have mentioned, we will be coming back to that. We will be working with our colleagues, and Sai, we want to say especially a special thanks to you for the support you have continued to give us and the work that as we progress this. I know the Secretary General's is fully supportive of this effort to get this MBI off the ground and operational. And I know you played no small part with members of the resident coordinators team and so on in getting this to happen. So thank you so much. Dr. Thomas, you know how much I admire your work and admire you. So thank you so very much for leading the process off and sharing this, because we certainly want advocates everywhere to be speaking about this. We will be working with the UN to identify our political advocates and our technical advocates to make this happen. We have already spoken to representatives from the three main SIDS region, and we are putting things in place. We'll be meeting with some really senior figures in the economic industry, so to speak, who will be helping us as advocates. And there's a lot of work that AOSIS will continue to do over the next 12 months to be able to add to this process, because it just must happen. What the minister said and the circumstances that he described for Antigua and Barbuda is the circumstance that Fiji could describe, Bahamas could describe, Dominica could describe, and so on and so on. Just keep listing the names. We must get this right, and we must do it quickly. The one point I want to mention in this is, and especially to Stephen, and it's as we look at all of these processes, we also have to make things, we have to simplify some of these applications to the institutions, recognizing the capacity of small states, especially as we deal with climate finance, whether it's GCF or the JEF or any of these institutions. We now have many players in the field, you know, the bank, the Green Climate Fund, and they're all many players to which we are all speaking to. And it would be wonderful if we could simplify processes so that we could take less time. And I'm not going to try to tell you how long it takes sometimes for us to get a project going and what happens by the time the project is realized. From if you might, from concept to project, it takes us a long time. And if we could simplify processes, we then know that the promises we hear, Madam Ambassador, and all of the dedication that I know the UK and others have committed to, if that is to become a reality and it is to be implemented, we need to have these the road to get the resources made easier so that small states can access these, and whether it is an assessment using MVI or otherwise, but we need to make the road easier so we can get there. I want to thank everybody for their input, and like students, somehow we're able to learn. Thank you.